Sandra, welcome. It's great to have you back. And um, everybody is excited about the topic that uh, sometimes has people challenged, and you're going to help make the challenges reduced.
We often associate the word feedback with a review, a critique, a performance management time. Are we, engaging in a process of feedback to um, meet our expectations of some standard? And so the word feedback hasn't really had much of a transformational element, particularly from my experience and what from the data shows. So I'm here to shed light on feedback can be a process where it can be transformative. And if it's packaged well and delivered effectively, it could be very, very impactful in a positive way for employees and organizations.
Fabulous. So, um, Sandra, what is performance feedback and how does it differ from traditional performance management?
Yeah, great question, Jonathan. Performance feedback is a process by which we're agreeing to some standard, metric or standard, where we want to move an employee ahead to reach those standards. So that's typically what happens in a performance review process. There's some standard or metric that an employee needs to meet, and they get together and they're reviewing whether the employee has hit that standard, met expectations, exceeded expectations, and so forth. So performance feedback is that process. Yeah, traditional performance management is a process where you go through, it's very structured, it's a routine, standardized forms, documentation. It's something that people have, and most employees and leaders both dread to have. It's a process that oftentimes miss that human component or human element. And so performance feedback coaching, I'm going to say, is the process by which we're helping leaders develop and utilize a coaching mindset in the feedback process. So what's missing in a traditional performance management, oftentimes, which is the human element, is intertwined within the performance feedback coaching process. And conversations are more tailored. It focuses on growth. It incorporates the human element. It's flexible to the individual. There's hopefully a sense of psychological safety and trust between the leader and the employee where feedback can be shared, both in terms of criticism and in terms of, compliments, what's been done well. So traditional performance management is backward looking. Performance feedback coaching is forward looking. It focuses on growth and development. And our premise is basically how do we get leaders to become coaches? And that's where the trend is moving to. And we see a lot of paradigms are shifting where that's a necessity. Leaders now need to learn how to be coaches for their employees. It's not just about checking off whether an employee has met the standards or expectations. There needs to be more. Just kind of if anyone wants to speak up here, I'm curious, how many of you, if you have any insight about traditional performance management systems, what have been your thoughts on that?
I'll
Eric?
jump, sorry, I'll jump in. We had a performance management system where I worked that was 30 years old and it
Hmm.
hadn't been changed for 30 years.
Hmm.
Managers were expected to write little essays, 1 or 2 page or 3 page sometimes,
Hmm.
essays about the employee. It used the meet standards rating, which everybody felt said they were mediocre
Hmm.
and it didn't have any interim coaching,
Hmm.
so I fixed that.
Right, exactly. And how do you think that made people feel?
They hated it. it
Yeah.
was it was a it was a report card on them, and it was one that was biased towards whatever the manager remembered about them. even
Mhm.
if you wrote it about your whole year, the manager highlighted what they were called. So it had a lot of
Mhm.
biases,
Mhm.
and it was very directly tied to merit, which in principle could be a good thing, but
Mhm.
it was deployed in ways that weren't a good thing. So
Mhm.
it was just and the managers had to spend 4 to 8 hours per employee uh, over individual employee anniversaries to accomplish it. So they were always writing performance evaluations throughout the whole year.
Wow, that sounds so rigorous. And then you put in all that effort and then they don't even remember what you wrote. They're not
No,
even
that's right.
focusing on
And
the
you
whole
piss them
picture.
off because you left stuff off.
Yeah, right,
And
right.
nobody read it anyway. So
Hmm.
that's the other part.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. So the companies need to have some level of performance management process, obviously. It's just how it's being conducted hasn't worked as effectively. Anyone else?
Eric
Anything?
had his hand up a couple of minutes ago.
Eric?
Oh, thank you. I'll be really quick. I should declare my bias first. For me at least, I've found almost no value in the traditional performance management approach. And when I was leading global talent solutions for ADP,
Hmm.
as early as 10, 15 years ago, there was a movement to essentially eliminate performance management and ratings as we knew it. And I think most of you would remember that, having gone through that phase. And so, even beyond what it is that's useful or not, I just wanted to provide a point of reference that the entrenchment of the process is so much bigger than anything having to do with performance management. It has so much to do with a combination of documentation, financial rewards and incentives, overall compensation planning, and it has massive implications in terms of the work that management has to do and the discretion applied. And so a lot of the traditional performance management made it very easy for managers to not do a lot and essentially displace accountability for any kind of feedback or ratings on being quote unquote forced by the system or by budget or by other things to produce a certain result. So the whole thing is doctored from beginning to end. Almost nobody gets any value out of it. So where you're
Hmm.
going is perfect. It just the reminder that in big systems, right, we're battling a system, not a philosophy. And there's a lot that goes into this.
Yeah, absolutely. Well said, Eric. And that's exactly the issue that we're seeing. It's this compliance, mundane obligation that leaders have to do, and leaders dread it too. So as much as I'm talking about the dread of the employee, leaders dread it. It's like, oh my gosh, now I have to have that conversation. How's the employee going to respond? You know, are they going to have backlash? How is this going to work out? So on both parts, it's just the conversation is very intense, dreaded, and oftentimes people, they try to withdraw or avoid it altogether. If they could, they would. So yeah, that's well said. I was on a podcast yesterday, and Dr. Mira Brancu, that was her name. She asked me, she said, this whole process of giving feedback, it sounds so like so much. You have to set aside so much time to give feedback to the employees and help them grow and use these, the different principles that you offer. What if there's those leaders that just want something very quick and they don't have time for all of that? I mean, all of us know those leaders that just want that quick, let's check off, have they met expectations or not? So, how would this work for someone like them? And I thought that was a brilliant question because we all know leaders like that, especially leaders that are so high performing and, they just want to get things done very quickly. And the answer is this is a philosophy. And it's a mindset of I care about my employees' needs. I'm tuning into who they are, where they are at in their career, what their interpersonal skills are like, what their personality is like, what's their skill set like, how motivated are they, how engaged are they. I look at the employee on so many different factors. and I'm tuning into them. So it doesn't have to be this long, rigorous process. In fact, Erwin, I think what you were describing sounded so much more rigorous than what can be done if performance feedback coaching is done effectively. And so it's really about the intention, the mindset of creating a two-way feedback where it's not one way, it's not about telling, but it's more about reaching alignment and reaching a mutual level of trust to move forward looking, help your employee grow and ultimately thrive. Obviously, that's going to affect the bottom line of organizations. So lots of moving parts with this. You know, what is the feedback message about? How clear is it? What's the intent behind the message? What's the purpose? What's the valence? And then who's the feedback giver? How is the leader perceived? Are they perceived as being judgmental, biased? Are they perceived as being too evaluative? And then the feedback recipient, who's the employee, are they ready to hear the feedback? So that's also an element in the feedback process. Are they ready, or are they just kind of passive aggressively just saying okay to every feedback process? So there's so many different moving parts to make sure that this feedback conversation actually works and it actually lands. And the goal is to make sure that the feedback conversation lands so that there can be a level of behavioral change or transformation. So yeah, I want to touch on some of the, what a feedback conversation needs in order for it to be effective. So I'll touch on that as we move forward in the presentation. Any questions so far? Okay. So, okay, with that said, let's have a little discussion. Let's create a little context around all this. If Jonathan, if you can help me break up our group here,
Yep.
the subgroups of 3,
Mm-hmm.
then we
I've
can have
got,
a conversation. If you can discuss what are your experiences, if you have been a leader giving feedback, or if you have been an employee receiving feedback, or if you're a coach trying to work with a leader giving feedback, talk about your experiences with that. What has worked, what hasn't? And then
and
how has expectations for feedback or your clients' expectations for feedback evolved in recent years?
so I heard that the discussions were deep. Sandra, take it away.
Yeah, thank you. Stephanie, Annie, you guys brought up, Sepide, you brought up some great examples, whether it be in the work setting where you have a leader commenting on what you're wearing, to make, because they have to, it has to match a certain brand of the organization, or, talking about how paradigms have shifted and now we have to sit across a screen and give feedback, and that human part is already missing, and then feedback is already so complicated as it is, so it just makes things all the more difficult. So those were great points, and paradigms have shifted, and what was acceptable before is not as prevalent now, and paradigms are constantly going to shift. So will there be a day that we go back to the way things were? It might happen. So paradigms are always shifting, and that's why as leaders we need to be agile, and we need to always tailor our position according to what is going on. But now you have a new generation in the workforce, a generation that needs coaching, and they need the development. And here I'll show you differences in how careers have shifted. There was a time that people would step into a role, and they would work their way up to climb up the linear ladder to get promoted. And their goal was to just get promoted in one job. We call that job security. Nowadays, the new generation really wants to work on their skill set and their competencies, and to have a nice portfolio. So if they want to go somewhere else, they're able to go there. And they expect their leader to help them on those competencies and the skill development and the career development. So nowadays, jobs are more fractional, part-time, gig jobs, contract work. There's so many nuances which make the feedback process so much more complicated and necessary. So the human aspect of feedback needs to be in place because of all these different types of jobs that people are working at. So people don't have access to their leaders all the time. They have to work a different job. The new generation expects to be coached for their career. And they expect their leader to tune in to what they need if they want to, move up in the organization. They expect their leader to analyze the gap between where they are and how to get them to that place through ongoing, real-time, time-bound coaching. And that's not the way that particular leader might have been led. So we see a big gap between what leaders or think they're doing or they should be doing and what employees are experiencing. And because of the paradigm shift, there needs to be, I say it here in the very last point here. There was a time where leaders could be bosses. Now paradigms have shifted and they need to be performance coaches. So the new generation, particularly Gen Zs, they're expecting that kind of human connection. I want to make sure my leader tunes into my needs, my career opportunities, my competencies. I want to walk away with a portfolio and say, if I want to go to my next job, I have had those career enhancement opportunities at the organization I'm at. They actually step into an organization with that expectations. And then you have leaders that say, oh, but why do they feel so entitled? It's not an entitlement, it's where the paradigm is shifting to. And that's where leaders need to be agile. You got to move according to where the paradigms are at. So any other comments about how paradigms have shifted? And then you brought up a good point, Annie. Now we're sitting across the screen. So there's more need to tune into who's my employee, how do they want to be heard? And Stephanie, you mentioned, how can I prepare for the feedback conversation? How do they best hear my message? Sometimes we coach leaders on how to talk with a neurodiverse employee. How do they best need to be heard? Are they uncomfortable with the screen time? Do they need a follow-up message? Do they need the structure? So really, there is no one size fits all approach to feedback. So leaders need to be effective at understanding how they need to tailor their message accordingly. And the paradigm shifts are requiring it, definitely. Okay, so that leads us to our next question, which is what is the gap between leaders and employees' experience of feedback? And there's a huge gap. So 65% of employees crave more meaningful feedback, yet 58% of managers are convinced they're already doing it. So these are some of the comments I get in my coaching practice. I've given feedback numerous times and employees just don't change. So remember, I'm a leadership coach. So I'm coaching these leaders and this is what they're telling me as I'm trying to get them to coach them on their employees. Every time I give a feedback conversation, I get presented with backlash. Then they say, my boss doesn't listen, my leader is not transparent. I see all the responses in the 360 reviews. So I'm actually seeing this gap, literally. I spent hours training and coaching my employee, and they're still not satisfied. So there is parts missing. And I'd like to make a point here that there are lots of leaders that want to do more than just the performance standards, the performance evaluations. There are leaders that want to give feedback. They want to coach their employees, but they just don't know how to do it because they're not meeting the employee where they're at. They're not tuning into their needs. They're not tuning into their career drivers, their signature strengths, their interpersonal skills, their overall performance. There's so many things that they need to tune into. And I'm going to uncover a model, which is our model that's in the book, that'll help leaders package feedback in such a way where it lands for employees. I will say this, because of this gap, there's one thing that needs to take place in a feedback conversation. First, there needs to be an understanding of the feedback. So does the employee understand what the feedback even is? Because I think a couple of you, Stephanie, you were saying this also. Well, are you saying this is the feedback, right? Is that what you mean? We're always prompting to try to understand what exactly are you trying to tell me? You know, are you trying to question my integrity with or my character of how I would, you know, present myself with something, or are you actually focusing on the behavior? So there needs to be a very clear understanding, and it's a leader's role to facilitate that process. Then the next part of it is, does the employee accept the feedback? Or at the very least, does the employee see the feedback as valuable? Okay. Once there is acceptance, the third stage is there a commitment to action? Is the employee ready to make some kind of change? If these components, any of these components are missing, the feedback conversation isn't as meaningful. So a lot of times the feedback conversations are just overly direct, a commentary, a critique, and that's all okay if the relationship is trusting enough where you can balance out some critique with some compliments. And but a real feedback conversation has to really be focused on buy-in, a two-way process, a mutual trust where it actually leads to some level of change. Any questions so far?
Sandra,
Jonathan.
this kind of touches our hearts, but what's the impact of performance feedback falling uh, in falling flat-footed for employees? What's the impact on engagement, on retention, and on
Mhm.
overall business performance?
Ye- Yeah, that's a great question. And that leads us to our next slide. Um, Employees that don't feel bought in or aligned with their leader and what's expected, and engagement diminishes, performance declines, and then there's ripple effects from there. So reduced productivity, reduced team morale. You have sometimes difficult employees in the workplace. Those leaders aren't giving proper feedback to the difficult employees, so there's a contagion effect. So when we talk about culture, it's how is the leader managing different employees? How are they managing the challenging employee, the competent jerk that's impacting other employees? So there's definitely an impact on so many different levels. And the evidence is clear. Now, employees that don't feel like they're heard, they're seen, they're treated unfairly, they're bullied, or they're not even understanding how to get to the next level of their career are not going to thrive, they're not going to perform. Obviously, that leads to the ROI. So definitely there's implications there. Okay, now I want to touch a little bit on the neuroscience. Okay, we talk about feedback, and I'm not a neuroscientist or anything, but this is important because it's important to understand physiologically what's happening to our bodies when we're in a feedback conversation. So naturally, we are hardwired to be in a high threat mode when we are facing a feedback conversation with someone else. So just naturally, because from an evolutionary perspective, we're seeking two things, either seeking pleasure or we're avoiding pain. And avoiding pain is a bigger need for us, or it's a bigger motivation for us. So when we're sitting with someone in a feedback conversation, employee and leader, our threat response is already high up. Our cortisol goes up, so we're already in fight or flight before a word has even been said. Now imagine once that leader starts talking, if they're not able to diffuse those defenses, get the cortisol down, the message is not going to land, or it's going to be dismissed, or it's going to be avoided. So I have the slides here. It shows it takes time for cortisol to return down to a normal state when we're in that fight or flight mode. And the research also shows, it's very interesting, that the same regions of the brain light up when we experience physical pain than when we experience emotional pain. So emotional distress from a physiological perspective lights up the same regions in the brain as physical pain. So that just shows how much these social interactions are so important and what a leader is doing to tune into their employees, make sure they're not feeling like they're treated unfairly, make sure they're not, obviously, not feeling like they're bullied. So if they are feeling like they're bullied, now take that on top of, imagine how much their cortisol is going to spike up. Now you lost them. So I'm just, I wanted to just kind of touch on this. If you want, after the presentation, I'm happy to send you any kind of research around the neuroscience, but I just wanted to touch on, there is evidence of why it's so important for us to be very thoughtful and deliberate in how we give feedback, especially if there is no psychological safety, which I will touch on next. If the employee doesn't feel like they trust us, and they don't feel like there is psychological safety to hear the feedback, then the feedback is not going to land, even if they try to say it in the best of ways. So we talk about the sandwich technique, for instance, right? This is why we called this presentation Beyond the Sandwich. We don't even hear sometimes the feedback when we're given the sandwich. Yeah, you're great, but there is this that you need to work on. We don't hear that middle part because the trust isn't even there. So we can be real as leaders and direct and critique people in a very authentic way. But there needs to be a level of psychological safety on the part of the employee. And I'm going to touch on that in a minute. Okay. Psychological safety refers to, let me go over this slide first. It's basically how a person feels comfortable to let their hair down and be themselves in an authentic way. Can they question their boss or disagree with their boss? Can they challenge the status quo? Can they make a mistake and be vulnerable about it? So we wish in feedback conversations, we can actually have this back and forth dialogue where we can actually share how we feel also, and we can be a little bit vulnerable. That psychological safety is key to the process. The leader has to instill it in them. So if you look at the behavioral change process, psychological safety is the foundation. That's the trust, it's the respect. It's the perception that I feel included. I feel treated fairly. I feel respected. I feel tuned into. And now you have an opening. If you look at it from the physiological standpoint, there's an opening there for the feedback to be heard. Less defensiveness, cortisol levels are coming down. We're getting out of fight or flight. There's a willingness to reflect. And then finally, the next level up is the behavior change. Let me ask you all something as we talk about psychological safety. Imagine, if you were ever on a committee or a task force or something where you had in a group assignment, what were some of the biggest challenges? You could imagine it or talk about from your own experiences. What were some of the biggest challenges being on a committee or on a group project? For those of you that are students, obviously you have a lot of experience with that.
A big one is competing perspectives on an issue.
Mm-hmm. Competing perspectives on an issue. Okay. What happens? Somebody has another opinion or thought, and you have a different conflicting one. How is that handled? Why is it a challenge?
Because people are locked into their positions in many,
Uh-huh.
so that when other people are explaining their point of view, the other person just doesn't agree or is not moving from their position.
And how does that feel to the, other people that have a different perspective?
It depends if they think there's the boss is advocating for something that they think
Mm-hmm.
is wrong too.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So it really depends on the relationships within the group too.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. So that's very normal. Competing ideas is normal. Competing ideas is actually makes for healthy team dynamics. So that's healthy conflict. But what happens, what we see a lot of times when psychological safety is missing, is people aren't willing to share. They're not willing to question someone else and disagree in a fair manner, in a respectable manner. So they just don't talk, or they back off, or they avoid, or they might come at them in an aggressive way. So psychological safety in a team setting is when people feel safe to be able to speak up and be themselves, and then sometimes, yeah, question someone that they disagree with in a healthy way, of course. Anyone else have any experience with that?
Yeah, we've got some.
Yes.
Engagement. I had a project a couple of years ago that required cooperation among over 200 different dev teams, and each dev team ranged in size between 5 engineers on the small side and over 20 engineers on the large side.
Mm,
And getting engagement was tough because it could be in a large company meeting and tell the organization what we're going to do, and
mhm,
everyone's going to nod their head wisely. But then afterwards, when we tried to measure acceptance and understanding, it was poor. And
uh-huh,
and so that's one of the challenges, I think, when there isn't psychological safety, when especially in large group settings, people don't feel like it's okay for them to share their challenges that they see with the direction the organization has issued a policy on. And they may even complain about it behind the scenes and work against you.
mhm. Yeah, absolutely. So not only are you reaching, so it's directly impacting performance,
Yeah,
directly,
right.
because people are afraid to speak up, and you see the implications there. So, I mean, that's huge. There's huge implications there. Wow. Um, Anyone else?
There are a couple of comments in chat.
Okay.
Annie or Stephanie, would you like to say what you were writing about?
Sure. I was just sharing that oftentimes in group settings, committee settings, I think certain personality types can win out unless there's set upon agreements beforehand about how decisions will get made.
Mm-hmm.
Often the loudest person or the person who's most assertive or aggressive. And I can think of a couple examples professionally where I think there were a lot of people in the room hoping that some feedback would be given to someone on the team
Mm-hmm.
for the way that they were steamrolling everyone else.
Mm-hmm.
And because that feedback never, there wasn't anyone courageous enough to give that feedback to that person,
Mm-hmm.
it just perpetuated itself in a way that made the whole group, committee, cross-functional team not function well.
Wow. Okay. So yes, exactly. Sometimes there's people that we need to directly address, and we need to be able to challenge them, and we need to set boundaries assertively. That doesn't mean you have to be aggressive, but you need to be assertive. Absolutely. It sounds like there wasn't enough psychological safety, and there was that fear. If I say something, am I going to get bullied? What's going to be the response? What's going to be the backlash? Okay.
Great. Thank you, Annie.
Yeah.
SJ, would you like to speak up at this point?
Sure. I was just thinking about different groups, and when we're not really intentional about creating that safe space or a sense of belonging, that we tend to move forward, and teams can get stuck. And oftentimes it's because we haven't provided an opportunity for people to share the why they're here. You know,
Mhm.
some may have a very specific value-based reason for being there. Others might have been assigned to the group.
Mhm.
There could just be various reasons, but if you don't check in on people's purpose and maybe shared values. So I also see people maybe stepping over each other's values just because they didn't know, not intentional or but they would have showed up differently or framed something differently had they known that someone's coming from a very values-based perspective. So I think
Mhm.
those things are important to lay out as well, and you know, get to know each other and individual strengths and what is their gift that they're bringing to the team, because sometimes we
Mhm.
jump into the work without understanding what people could bring, and we don't
Mhm.
surface that.
Yeah, absolutely, Stephanie. And it sounds like you're saying a lot of, it corresponds to a lot of what I've been saying here is that, yeah, everyone's needs need to some level be met. And that's what helps create the environment of psychological safety. And if a leader is actually initiating that tuning in, what do you want to bring to the table, what are your values, what's important to you, then they're able to tailor the conversation, and they're able to, everyone feels heard, feels safer to be able to share. So it's okay to have your own values, bring it to the table, and we'll work with each other. So that's what a psychologically safe team does, and they do question each other, and they do challenge each other, and they do question status quo, because those are the smartest minds, the ones that are able to challenge respectfully, and with empathy. So absolutely,
Yes.
very well said. Yes, Jonathan.
One of the things I found makes a big difference is when you've got a group of people who have a lot of ideas
Mm-hmm.
to keep reminding the team that what we're working on right now came from a comment somebody made at the previous meeting, name the person who made it, and constantly acknowledge their contributions to how we got to where we are now. And I find that kind of pulls in more disparate feedback, which gets us to better solutions. And people keep coming back because they feel like their contribution has made a difference, or they saw their colleagues' contributions make a difference. And they know at some point they're going to have something that will differ from anything anybody had thought about, that will be like, oh gosh, that's our great next step.
Yes, absolutely. It feels good to get good feedback. That feels good, and it feels good to be liked and appreciated. And as we go back to the neuroscience, it releases that dopamine, and we all love that. And we need that, and we crave that. So that feels good. And that's a great way, Jonathan, you named it, how leaders can incentivize people to share and come in with their thoughts and ideas. So great, very, very well said. Okay. Learning and development leaders. Peers, they're in a tricky situation because they have to keep what's in place, which is the performance management process. But then they also have to be the people that are change agents to help shift the culture where there is a feedback culture. What they can do in place is really, it's about creating that environment of this psychological safety on every level. So it really needs to be promoted on so many different levels. And they need to, push for the environment of helping leaders become coaches. And I think that's what I want to, touch on today is I really, both my colleague Ken and I, we really believe that that's really the solution for learning and development leaders, is to help shift the culture, to help leaders become coaches in their practice. And that's what do we do as coaches? We tune in, we assess, we facilitate, we empathize, we mirror, all those things that coaches do. If only a leader can do it, you'd see such a big difference, in the work of their employees. Leaders need to cultivate this mindset. So it's really, like I said earlier, it's a mindset about coaching their teams and tailoring their approach and understanding the individual needs and initiating the conversations where they understand the individual needs. That question will be a lot more clearly answered once I go over the model. So I'd like to touch back into that, and I'll keep referring back into it if that's okay, Jonathan.
Oh, yeah. I like the
Okay.
model.
Okay, good. Okay. I alluded to it earlier. Say it again. The necessary conditions for successful feedback is understanding, acceptance, and commitment to action. So, for many of you, think about a time where you've given feedback. If any of these elements were missing, how did the feedback land?
And you're specifically saying for the person receiving the feedback, they need to understand it, they need to accept it,
Yes,
and then they will change to the extent that they make a commitment to action and follow
yes,
through.
exactly. So in order to meet these needs, it has to be a two-way dialogue. Because the leader has to check for understanding, has to check for acceptance, and has to check for the next steps. What are you going to do with what I just said? Are you bought into this?
Sandra, let me jump in
Yeah,
here
sure.
because this is fine if you think that a performance feedback process is to help people deal with their errors or their weaknesses.
Mm-hmm.
But I think that the commitment to action implies there's something that needs to go get fixed, but it doesn't necessarily have to be that way. I find spending a little bit of time on past performance and using examples from past performance to think about how to improve future performance for whatever the goals are for the next forward period.
Mm-hmm.
And so I spend the time talking about the goals
Mm-hmm.
and not dwelling on how to remember you didn't do this right here. I want you to commit to fixing that. That's not a positive interaction in my experience.
Okay.
And so I say, look, learn from the past, figure out what you didn't do well. I'll be happy to give you more detailed feedback if you want it. But for the future, you need to kind of incorporate that kind of thinking to these goals that we're going to be working on this coming year.
That's a great point you brought up, Erwin, and it leads us to this doesn't have to be necessarily negative or a correction. So we always say when we want someone to change, it's what do you want them to do more, less, or differently? Or maybe it's more of you're doing great. Let's keep that going. Some people, most people don't even get that. So the commitment to action could be you're doing great. Let's keep that going.
I would rephrase it as use the feedback wisely.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. So feed forward is absolutely what we want to focus on here. We use feedback to get perspective on what has occurred, and then feed forward is the key. So we want to be forward looking. That's why we include the commitment to action. It's not necessarily to change something you've done wrong. It could be to just leverage what you're doing great. In fact, that's what's missing for so many employees. Their strengths aren't being leveraged. Their career drivers aren't being leveraged. So the feedback is meaningless. It's good job. You're doing great at that. Okay. How about the future? What are you committing to? So I think we're saying something similar as far as setting the goals for the future. Anyone else?
I have a feeling that this can often be framed without having to look for mistakes. Instead, framing it as here's how to get to the next level. And Sandra, you were talking about how people want feedback so that they know what they need to do in order to move to the next level career-wise.
Yes.
And so if you access that, which is exciting to people, and
Mhm.
then you talk about the feedback in light of their personal career goals, then
Mhm.
it's about how can you get further up the mountain.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes. So, but it's still, I love the way you framed it, Jonathan, still following these steps in some
Yes.
format. So I want to delve into the model because I think that'll give a little bit more perspective. But the idea here is that there's a process. It's a two-way process to build that trust. And it is to look in the future. But we have to make sure I hear this all the time from my clients. I don't even know where I stand. I don't know what they mean. I've gotten the feedback. I'm so surprised when I see my 360 review. There's such a gap between how I see myself and how I'm perceived. And then is there an acceptance in the commitment? So that's why it's like this is the framework of the components of what's necessary. Now we want to get into tailoring. Okay, how do we understand the employee? So I'd like to introduce you to a framework for that, and that's where I'll introduce my model. I have a series of questions, I always say, for feedback preparation for managers. Think about things. You also want to tune into your recipient. Are they ready to hear you? Does the feedback need to be shared? Does the feedback need to be shared at this moment? A lot of times people blurt out feedback in the middle of meetings. Is it the right time? Can we pull the person aside and give feedback? What is the relationship like to facilitate the understanding, acceptance, and commitment? How will the feedback help the person grow and develop? So this delves in a little bit deeper to Erwin, what I was talking about. It sounds a little bit similar to what you're saying. Once you have this list, it delves into the understanding, acceptance, and commitment. Do you want to take another minute to look at this? Is the desired behavior change realistic in terms of magnitude? That's a big one. For those of you that are coaches, you know this. We know people that don't have a huge magnitude for change. So what's the point of keep giving feedback?
I just wanted to comment. One thing that I've learned is not all people want to move up the career ladder. Some people are very content where they're at,
Mm-hmm.
or they're content with where they're at, and they don't
Mm-hmm.
necessarily want to move up.
Mm-hmm.
So it's about tapping into, where do they want to be or what brings them joy at work and giving feedback around that and how they
Mm-hmm.
can contribute in that way so it's more meaningful. So it's just something to,
Yeah.
have to be aware of. Uh,
Yeah.
so again, the magnitude for change, they may not be motivated to change. Like I don't want to go back to school and get my master's. I'm never going to do that.
Mm-hmm.
Still an opportunity for
Yes.
me to still be engaged, right?
Right.
Best self forward.
Right, exactly. And then those conversations is really about how much can we leverage the best of them so that they can be most happy in their career. So the change doesn't have to be something that it's transformative. It could be about leveraging,
Yeah.
enhancing, just fine tuning, or just embracing their values. And we're going to talk about as we coach the high potential talent. That's a lot of what we're doing. So our model, okay, our model is based on two components. For those of you that know this older article by Amy Cuddy, she categorizes people into two components, how we perceive others into two components, their warmth and their competence. And for those of you that have studied leadership, you know that most leadership models fall somewhere along the range of interpersonal skills and task skills. So these are the two lenses for which we've created the model. And then based on that, we've created a 2x2, which is basically what we go over in our book. And the two spectrums are overall performance and interpersonal competence. And then we have the high and low for both. So we have a high, which are, here, this might be a little bit easier to understand. are star players, high potentials. You have your toxic producers, or a lot of people like to call them competent jerks. These are highly high producers, great performers, very weak on interpersonal skills. And I'd like to delve into them as well. And then you have the lovable learners. These are the people that are very eager, very hungry, very interested in understanding and learning more. They get along great with others, but they're weak on the performance. There's some kind of knowledge, skill, or deficit that a leader needs to troubleshoot for. And then you have the departure candidate, and these are the people that some organizations keep, but they might be on their way out the door. So depending on how a leader can, gives feedback or accepts the situation of that particular employee, the feedback is different in all these situations. A lot of what we talk about in our book is how to package feedback in a way that works for each of these different types of employees. So a lot of the things you bring up is, well, if we're in a meeting and you have this type of employee and you have that type of employee, well, what do you do? Or how do you, all the nuances are answered when we understand who the employee is, because feedback is different with each different type of employee. And like you all said, it's not always about changing behavior. Sometimes it's just about leveraging and encouraging the strengths and complimenting on the strengths. That helps them thrive. So I'm going to start off with talking about the different quadrants and the coaching approach we use. We have a different name for the coaching approach we use. For the star players, we want to enhance performance. For the competent jerks, we want to manage performance because their performance is a liability because of their interpersonal skills. And then for the lovable learners, we want to develop their performance because the performance is low. And then performance improvement, as you all know, that's a term they use in HR. These are the individuals that are low lows, and we want to work around the progressive discipline processes in our feedback process. So let's start with the high potentials. These are your people that are doing great. They have great interpersonal skills, they get along with others, and a lot of times organizations ignore these individuals. They assume that if these individuals are performing, then they're okay. The reality is that this group right here is the group that organizations, leaders need to focus on probably the most. They're high potential talents. Leaders need to understand what are their career drivers, what are their career strengths. Stephanie, you said a beautiful thing. You said, what are their values? What are their values? How do I align to their values? How do I make sure that what they do on the job is aligned to their values? How do I identify those strengths? What's going to keep them here in the next few years? How do I help them thrive? So these star players, these high potentials, are very important. Losing them is a liability. So you definitely, leaders need to really focus on how to package feedback in such a way where you're helping their signature strengths unfold and be revealed, but also you want to leverage their strengths and help them identify their career drivers and match those career drivers to what they're doing on the job. So that's what effective feedback approaches look like. And feedback in this quadrant is really about complementing their signature strengths, helping them identify them, and have a roadmap for how you can get them to the next level that matches their career. So how many of you have heard of this? Stay interview. We have a consultant, Bev K. She's a colleague of ours, and she came up with it, and it's very clever. I did exit interviews for years, and I'm like, why are we spending so much time asking people why they leave a job when we could have just asked them, what is it that's going to keep them in the job? So this is brilliant, and this is exactly what a lot of leaders don't do with their high potentials. So this is a feedback conversation that's very important to have with these kinds of individuals. What's going to keep you here? What rubs you the wrong way? What wakes you up in the morning? How can I meet your career plans? How can I help you on that portfolio you want to build? What drains you? What helps you thrive? And then what's so important is leaders need to understand and identify, especially when they're identifying high potentials early on. What is it? What is their career driver? If I see management potential here, I should place them on a task force where they're actually leading. If they just want to be a specialist, what can I do to enhance that special craft that they have? How do I give feedback to help them enhance that? Maybe they're a generalist and they like to work cross-functionally. What do I do to get them to a place where they get to feel like they're doing that? Let me give them a little bit more variety in their work. Let me give them feedback on how they can have variety so they could be an effective generalist. Some people are just entrepreneurs, natural entrepreneurs, and they're entrepreneurs within organizations. We like to call them intrapreneurs. They're internal entrepreneurs. As a leader, how am I giving them feedback and encouraging that entrepreneurial part of them? So with the high potential, like I said, the goal of feedback here is to help them leverage all the good qualities, all the talents, and help them enhance their career. Because what happens is if those needs are not met, they're going to get bored and they're likely to leave. And everybody wants those high potentials. So this is an important group to focus on. Okay, our next group are the people that are low on the performance, but high on the interpersonal skills. So these people are hungry, they're eager to learn, they're willing, people like them. Remember, it's very important to have the interpersonal skills on the job, as we all know, because of those conflicting ideas we have in meetings. If we have someone that doesn't know how to handle the conflict and is constantly dismissing, shutting down, not creating a space for psychological safety, then ideas are never heard, productivity doesn't happen. So these people, at the very least, they're team players. They get along with you. They listen to you. They're willing. Yes, Jonathan.
You said something, I can't remember exactly what it is, when we were preparing,
Yeah.
that reminded me of something I heard through a podcast or I listened to a part of an audiobook, and they talked about super communicators.
Mhm.
They ask questions because they've got these high interpersonal skills. They ask
Uh-huh.
questions that bring forth information from other people that wouldn't have come out otherwise.
Mm-hmm.
And so they're maximizing the overall performance of their team or their department and well beyond what they, as individual contributors to the technical content of their work, um, well beyond that technical contribution they make. They
Mm-hmm.
maximize everybody else's contributions.
Yeah, absolutely. We're all interconnected. So if one person shows up and knows how to facilitate a discussion, they really bring that energy in and it's adding so much value. That's why it's so important for everyone on the team is playing a role and impacting one another. So great point. With these individuals, you really want to do a troubleshooting process. And you want to identify what is the knowledge, skill, or deficiency that they need to work on. It could be that this individual needs to work on something that seems interpersonal, like presentation skills or executive presence. There's lots of those. But the feedback goal here is for leaders to be able to troubleshoot a process where they identify what it is that they specifically need to work on, what is the deficit, and then have a clear plan of how you're going to get them to excel on that performance level. And usually the performance is short term, something very targeted, very specific, and we see a difference. I have clients like that where they'll call me and they say this person needs to just work on their executive presence. They're highly motivated. It's something very targeted. So that's what the coaching looks like. And the feedback conversations is about encouraging these individuals to get them to perform. Now, sometimes if you go through the whole process and with all the feedback that they receive, they're still not performing, then it's a question of whether they're a good fit. So there's a set limit for how much, somebody can perform. Some people can perform. If they've hit their limit and it's not a good fit, maybe the feedback conversation is about repositioning them. Okay, and now we have a very fun group of individuals, which I like to call the toxic performers. So I don't know if anyone has actually pulled out a knife on you, but these individuals, sometimes when you're dealing with them, it really does feel like they're pulling out a knife on me. They are very highly skilled in terms of performance. Their performance bringing a lot of revenue to the organization. I've worked with many leaders like this. In fact, I would say this has been over the years. Now I'm trying to move away from this group, but a vast majority of my clients. These are individuals that they're performing and organizations think that they're high potentials. They are mixing these individuals up with high potentials, and they're not really high potentials because they're not getting along with others. They're either being not getting along with others for various reasons, being dismissive, not showing empathy, being overly abrupt, overly abrasive, overly direct. They're just rubbing people the wrong way, and the impact of their behavior is this contagion effect of a toxic environment. So employees do not have a good time working under this individual. And leaders often fail to give feedback to these individuals because they assume that they're just performing. Well, if they're performing, they're bringing revenue to the firm. Yeah, they're a jerk, but what am I going to do about it? I hear that all the time. In the long run, these people are going to decrease revenue because the toxic environment that they are creating is going to have implications. So with these individuals, the feedback approach is about helping them see their blind spots and helping them identify the impact of their behaviors. So feedback is targeted about impact. And usually these individuals should go through a 360 program. A lot of them go through coaching. There's so many different types of these individuals, ranging from someone that just doesn't understand that they're a jerk and they would love to shed light on their approach, to people that are literally clinically narcissistic. So organizations have to make a decision about whether they want to keep these individuals on board, given the liability of their behaviors. And so I'm not going to spend too much time touching on the fourth quadrant because we don't have a lot of time, but I'll be very brief here. These individuals are the low performers, low interpersonal skills, low performance. And what we like to do with these individuals, feedback is about helping them understand how they're going to take action in order to change. So the change conversation is key for these individuals. In fact, the change conversation needs to be very specific, time-bound, consequential. It's the if you don't change, then this will happen. We align our feedback conversations usually with the progressive discipline process of the organization. So the question becomes, is there any, we first, you want to, as a first step, check in, is there any desire for these individuals to want to change? Can they change? Have I tried everything to get them change and it's still not working? So there's a huge cost in keeping these employees as well. Okay, any thoughts so far?
I wanted to ask a question about this as far as Dr. Trober knows that I'm working on the trauma-informed approach.
Mm-hmm.
If someone is shut down, do you have some protocols or questions or awareness of if someone is withdrawn or shut down and they're not performing for a reason? And
Mhm.
get into that instead of, you're screwing up, we're going to kick you out if you don't get busy. Do
No, it's a great question. Yeah, absolutely. So it's if you've gone through the whole troubleshooting process. So the process really, and this is necessary for this model. You have to identify each employee's needs.
Mm.
Where are they at? What's going on? A lot of times leaders don't even tune into what's going on a personal level with someone. Why is someone not performing? Is there something personal going on? Is it a knowledge, skill, or deficit? So if you go back to my flow chart here, you'll see there's a troubleshooting process. Is there something personal going on? Is there a motivation deficiency? Oh, it sounds like there's a motivation deficiency. Is the motivation a personal thing, or is it something because of the environment or the job or the role? So leaders really have to know how to troubleshoot what's going on. And yes, if there's a temporary performance issue that's not based on their skills and abilities, they need to tune into that. So that's a great question. You never want to jump into you're fired without going through the process.
Sandra, I would add here that for any of these kind of toxic employees, you
Mhm.
really need to get HR involved before you start getting into the tough coaching conversations with them,
Mhm.
because
Yeah.
this stuff can turn into a company level lawsuit and cost the
Mhm.
company a lot of money.
Yeah,
And
absolutely.
it'll cost the manager years of
Mhm.
work. So it's better to consult with HR before you just jump in to saying the wrong things to that type of person, or the
We
other types of people too, but this
Yes.
one in particular.
Yeah, no, that's a great point, and I'm glad you highlighted on that. The feedback conversations with this quadrant right here need to be aligned with the progressive discipline policies of the organization. So HR absolutely needs to know about what's going on. And if any of you are presented with these kinds of individuals, I usually decline these cases. I don't take them as a coach. So this is a big warning. And usually, Erwin, these people have a lot of legal legal situations on them. There's a lot going on, yes. So absolutely, HR needs to be consulted with. Um, but when a leader sees this, I'm talking about the leader and the employee, when they see performance is declining, now we need to move into progressive discipline with the help of HR.
You often the this person has been moved from managers that couldn't deal with them to new other managers.
Mm-hmm.
So they get very good at not being responsible for what they do. And
Yeah,
HR doesn't always deal with it well either.
right.
So because it's a big problem for the managers. It's like sentencing them to 2 years of
Mm.
documentation.
Yeah, absolutely. And, there are some managers that I've worked with that would really like to get rid of them, and there's some legalities there, and sometimes they can't. So that's why we actually don't delve into this too much, because there is some nuances based on the organizational decisions and how they're going to deal with that. So there's legalities there. So absolutely. But as an initial step, you first want to make sure before I take it there, let's make sure I'm clear. Here's what I think you need to do. Here's the impact of your behavior. Here's what'll happen if you don't perform. Feedback is more geared around time-bound, consequential feedback. Then obviously, if that doesn't work and you see patterns, you collaborate as a leader in an organization with HR. So yeah. Okay. Okay, so any questions about this model? Any other questions?
I think you've explained it well, and that would explain that there aren't questions right now.
Okay.
Uh, so Stephanie has just mentioned that she sometimes finds that these individuals have never received honest feedback and have been passed passed along to another department or manager. And she also mentioned she doesn't take on those individuals, but she'll take on their boss to help them coach more effectively with direct to actionable feedback.
That's exactly it. Yeah, exactly. Coaching the boss is where a lot of it stems from. So that's a great approach.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, I want to we only have 10 minutes. So you tell me how you want to do this. You all vote here, okay? We can quickly review a feedback technique, or I can send it to you afterwards, or I can quickly touch on receiving feedback.
I want to hear about receiving feedback.
Okay. Anyone else? Preference?
I vote
And
for that too.
Yeah, okay. Okay, so let's move into that. Really quickly, I will send you all the slides, by the way, and I'm also going to send you an article that came out with SHRM and ATD that reviews all of this. It just fresh off the press, came out yesterday, so I'm going to send all of you that as well. But this is a process of behavior change that we go through based on my original book, Three-Step Process. Another quick note I will say very quickly here. There are millions of feedback techniques out there. I wouldn't say millions, but a lot of them. And you probably all have your favorite one. Are those models, though each of those different feedback techniques can tie into different aspects of our model and we map it out. Okay, so some of you like SBI, great. We use that a lot with performance management, performance. So those feedback techniques we still use them. They're great. But this is about identifying your employee and meeting the employee where they're at. And you can use those different feedback models as you see fit. Everyone has their favorite one. Okay. So receiving feedback. One of you, I think, mentioned you work in a nonprofit. I have a client right now in a nonprofit, and she has a very, very difficult time with receiving feedback because she feels that feedback is coming at her, that she's being judged, she's misunderstood. So she dismisses the feedback every single time. There's this defensiveness. So the thing with receiving feedback is you first have to form a relationship with yourself. Calm yourself down. You literally have to calm yourself down. We talked about this earlier. You're in fight or flight when you're receiving feedback. Take a deep breath and be open to whatever you hear. You don't necessarily have to agree. Okay, so you have to keep perspective, ask for clarity. Ask for how this is feed forward. So what can I do more, less, or differently in the future? Remember, leaders don't have these skills. So they're probably going to critique you on the past and what happened and stay in the past without moving into what's the commitment to action in the future? What could you do more, less, or differently in the future? So you sometimes need to manage your own boss. What can I do more, less, or differently in the future? Reflect. Don't ruminate. And let's not personalize the style of the leader. Many leaders don't know how to give feedback. So this is a craft. That's why we're here today. Pause and breathe. Listen carefully. Don't ruminate. Don't keep analyzing it. Keep perspective. Acknowledge what has landed. So no matter what, you want to say, it sounds like you're saying this, and I could see that. Then you decide what to do next. Yes, Jonathan.
Sandra, you mentioned don't ruminate.
Mm-hmm.
It's kind of a natural response that people have when they are getting feedback that's negative. They're already hijacked by their fear system. What can you do to help people to reflect as opposed to ruminate? Is there something you can help people do
I,
to deal with the underlying emotion that causes the rumination to kick in?
Yeah, absolutely. Look, it's very difficult. It's not easy receiving feedback, especially if it's coming in a negative way. I always say there's two things. You either can surrender to what is wholeheartedly and accept it, or you can do something to take action with it. If it's not one of the two, the in between, going in your head and rethinking it over and over again, is not going to solve anything. So a decision you can make is either I'm going to surrender to it and accept it, or I can be proactive and actually take action.
Great. Thank you. A couple of people said you're really interested in the receiving feedback. I invite you to speak up about what you're seeing and what
Okay.
you're hearing right now.
Mhm.
And is there any piece missing for you that you'd like to hear from Sandra?
I'd like to delve a little deeper if no one has questions. Here's a
No.
little model for you. First, get into the content. What I'm hearing you say is this. Okay, then you got to delve a little deeper. What's the need? What does this person need from you? So for instance, my client is too much in the weeds with this employee that she's receiving feedback from, or I'm sorry, peer that she's receiving feedback from. And so I say, what is it that she actually needs? Put yourself in her shoes. What is she trying to tell you that she doesn't know how to articulate to you? So she's coming at you in a hostile way. What is the need? Well, the need, I could see that. I micromanage a little. I'm in the weeds. I get too involved. And then what are you feeling? Then you work on your own feeling. It's about managing yourself in that moment. Any questions, thoughts?
I guess I just want to quickly say that the I statements, stay in that objective mode.
Mm-hmm.
And this is something that my husband's got really good at using with the guys on his team is when I see or hear, I feel because, and now I want so that, just having a formula ready to go that covers these categories from the I perspective versus the you perspective.
Yeah, absolutely. So just the way us as recipients, we're on the defense, they're on the defense too. So the I is I'm taking account for my own feelings in this. Now, I might not agree with you, but I see it this way, I hear it this way, as opposed to you. You don't get it. You don't get me.
Right, more psychological safety, right? Let's bring
Mhm.
this is my perspective where I'm coming from.
Yeah. Remember, leaders fear feedback too. Everyone's walking on eggshells. The employee, the leader. That's why I really highlight on the concept of psychological safety.
Sandra, this has been fascinating. These are actionable steps. The model helps us organize how we think about the feedback process and the different ways to approach people who are in different categories. And I noticed that people really liked that list of questions. Uh, it's a
Okay.
reminder of what can go into the planning for feedback to make it more effective, to help it land better, and I guess also to prepare the manager or other person who's going to give the feedback. So this has been really useful. Thanks.
Sure, it's been my pleasure, and I'm happy to be a sounding board for any of you if you want to reach out. after this session. I really want to contribute about this topic. I'm very passionate about it, and I would love to see a change in how, you know, people are experiencing feedback out there. So thank you for attending. It means a lot to me. And yes, I will follow up with you all with my white paper. And if you want the slides as well, I can send you that.
Uh, is there anybody who does not want the slides sent to you? I'm seeing at least a couple of yes, love to see the slides
Okay.
in the chat. And I'll remind people, and it's high up on the chat, that Sandra's book is available at Barnes and Noble, and also at Amazon. And it's got the model in it. It's based on the model.
Thank you all.
Thank you, Sandra. And
Take
thank
care.
everybody for all your participation.
Yes. Thank you all for all your participation. Best of luck in your endeavors. And hopefully we'll come across each other again soon.
Thank you so much.
Okay, take care.
Thank you.
Before-
Bye-bye.